In this segment, I'd like to take a few minutes to go over some little recommendations and tricks and tips that I would use in the general ledger. These might be things that you can use throughout the fiscal year, but particularly at year end and audit time when you're preparing, looking back over a year. These are some of the things you might want to keep in mind. So let's get started. And I'm going to first go to the periodic processing in the general ledger. And of course, before you can make your first journal entries in any module for the new year, so in other words, before you can make an entry to period 1 of the new fiscal year, you have to perform the function called create last year data. This should only be done once, obviously, each year. And there's the gatekeeper question that asks you, have you done your backup? And I hit the space bar to put a check in that box. And notice that the rest of the screen is basically grayed out until I press the enter key. And then the screen comes to life. So you always have to answer the gatekeeper question and hit the enter key, and then you can fill in the rest. And resetting journal entries to 1, I would always put a check in that box. The retained earnings account, that would be your account for your fund balance account. In this particular chart, they use a retained earnings. Copy to next year budget is usually no. Do you want a zero next year budget? No. Those two questions have to do with places that have time on their hands and have gone ahead and entered the budgets already for the next year, which you can do if you have time before you finish one year. There's actually a column in the chart where you can enter next year's budget into the current year, and then this is a function that will then roll that over for you and make that next year budget the current year budget. And then, of course, you'd zero that out if you did that. So if you did that, entered it into a year before you did this function, you'd want to say yes to copy it and yes to zero it out. The copy inactive accounts with zero balances, generally I say yes to that. And so I would generally recommend yes to that. And then you perform that function. And then the printout that it does in this case is not something that you have to keep. So it does want to print out, but it's really a meaningless report. All right, so that step, most people have that down pretty well. And so you would do that once a year. Then the other function that you use on this menu is the update the current year. And you can perform the update the current year as many times as you want. Now, obviously, when you do this create, it's doing a temporary close, you might say. And that's why that asks you for your retained earnings or fund balance account, because it's doing a temporary close. But you still have activity for that prior year, and you may for another month or two. So then when you do make changes, you have to do the update the current year. And you can do this, like I say, as many times as you want. You can only run it when you're in last year. So the current year in this sample chart of accounts is 2007. So it's telling me I can only run it in last year, in 2006. So you can't run that in the wrong year. But you can run it as many times as you want, as often as you want. Then you do not ever want to use the clear and close. I have no customers that I think need to use that, nor do you need to ever use the month end. Never any reason to do that. Nor do I have anyone that I believe needs to use the consolidate the master files. However, some of you may use the remove the prior year. This allows you, again, there's a gatekeeper question, and it allows you to do an inquiry and see how far back. Now, this sample data doesn't have multiple years in it, but some of my sites have data going back to 1990s, and certainly at this point you could remove some of those years if you like. It particularly helps me when I come to do an upgrade that I don't have to bother converting all those 10-year-old files. But you can keep those as long as you want. So really, the create you do once a year, the update you do as many times as you need, and then the remove as desired. Okay, so that's the periodic processing, and The update, I might mention, I sometimes get calls during the year. Before you're doing the create last year, you may want to make sure, and perhaps just do it in the blind, that you do an update the current year just before you do the create last year. So what I'm suggesting is that before you do the create last year, switch into what at this moment is the prior year. Do an update. I always hear from a few sites each year that they discover a year later that they never did a final update from 2 years ago. And so that's thrown off their chart of accounts. And we'll talk more about that, and some of the other tips I have will help you recognize that and prevent that from happening. But just think about what I'm saying here in terms of you're about to create a whole new year. You can only do this update in the prior year. So you may want to do that before you then grandfather that year, and it's no longer, you're now 1 year removed and you won't be able to do that update again. So if there's ever any doubt, you might want to do that. Okay, so let's move on to those are some of the thoughts on the periodic processing. I'd like to go to the journal transactions. And there are two main audit reports, the journal and the activity report. The journal report, the strength of this report is the fact that you can print it by entry number, which is, of course, the sequence of which things took place. So one thing that I have, sometimes you have an amount that you're looking for, and you're wondering, I've got this dollar amount, I think it's in a chart, but I'm having a hard time finding it. One particular report that I sometimes use at year end is I do a full year journal, which is my 12 periods. I'm going to skip everything else. I'm going to do it by entry number. I'm going to do both just because I want to cover my bases in case I have some things that are unposted. And the trick here is that I go to a file. And here I'm going to call this journal 2007.txt. And because when I go to a file, it is a text file, I always use the .txt extension. So I'm putting this in my reports folder, and so I'm creating a file. I happen to have done this already, so I'm going to overwrite. I'm going to say yes. So it creates a file for me. And what I'm going to do now is go into my Windows, and I'm going to open up my WordPad. And in my WordPad, I'm going to say open. And it's going to my reports folder because I was there before. That was the last place I was in. But you might have to navigate through your computer. You might have to pull down your navigation and navigate to that reports folder or wherever you put the file. I don't see anything because it's looking for rich text formatted files, the default in WordPad. And incidentally, I'm using WordPad as opposed to Notepad because Notepad has a size limit as to how big a file it can open, where WordPad does not. And a file like this could be hundreds of pages long. So I choose text files, and it shows me my text files. And there's the text file I just created, the journal from 2007. So I'm going to double click on that, and it brings up my report in the text window. And what I like about having it in a text file now, I can use a trick such as using the edit and find. So let's say I'm looking for an amount that I'm out of balance or a magic number. Now, hopefully, of course, if the number is out of balance because it's the sum of multiple numbers, doing a find on that number isn't going to hit the jackpot for you. But this often saves me a lot of trouble. So let's say I'm looking for a number and it's 5,000, and I use a comma because you'll notice the amounts as they're formatted on the page have commas in the thousands. So I'm going to use 5,000 comma $93.08 is my number that I'm looking for, and I do a find. And while this could be hundreds of pages long, using that little trick, it allows me to drill down and find the amount that I'm looking for. And I can look and see whether that shows up anywhere else on the report, and it does not. So I know that that's my one entry right there. I also can see what the entry number is. That column is the entry number, so that was entry number 1000. And by the strength of the journal, again, is that it gives you the context of what that entry was part of. And so I can see the other entries around it. So that is one of the nice things I like about a journal. Sometimes on an activity report, if I spot an entry on an activity report, and it's the activity report sorts it by GL account number, and I'm not seeing the other side of the entry right next to it on that activity report because the other side went to a different account. But if I know what the entry number is, I can print the journal by entry number, and I can see where the other side of the entry went that way. So that is, again, a real strength of using the journal, the fact that you can print it by entry number. The activity report, similarly, I could do a full year report if that's the way I wanted to look at my data, and I can go to a file and I can do a search on that as well, but it is going to be sorted by account. Now notice I do not have the option here of doing posted or unposted or both. This always does both. So it always includes, the activity report always includes all entries whether they're posted or not. But again, it gives you a different view of the data. The edit transactions allows you to see what's been unposted, because the only thing that would ever show up here is the unposted entries. And so if you're working in last year, for example, and you're finalizing the year, you can see if there's any entries that are unposted. Of course, the journal would also allow you to do that. Sometimes what happens, a common mistake or problem at the year end, starting a new year, is entries get into the wrong year. A user in one of the modules, whether it's accounts receivable, accounts payable, or payroll, they post to the wrong year. So you end up with journal entries that are to the right period perhaps, but in the wrong year. So they're posted to period 1 in last year when they should have been period 1 of the current year, and in a similar way they post to period 12 of the new year when it should have been period 12 of the last year. And what I would do in a case like that is I would use the journal and I would pick the period that I'm looking for. So, for example, I might be in last year, and I could pick period 1 through period 1, and I could just ask for the unposted entries, because obviously anything that was in period 1 from the last year should have been posted many months ago. And so if I ask for this report 1 through 1 of the unposted entries, I'm just going to get the entries that shouldn't really be there. I could produce this report. I've got a nice listing of what those entries are. And then I can come to the edit and I can simply call up those entries and zero them out. That way I don't have to make reversing entries. I've got a list of what they are. They're in the wrong year. I've got the printout. I'm going to zero the amounts. Then I can post those zero entries just to get them out of the unposted list, but they'll have no effect in the wrong year. And then what you would do is go to the correct year and then use your journal transactions and enter them in there. So that would be one way to solve that problem, and you can do that in both years, obviously. So if I'm in the current year, I could come here and I could do a journal, and I could say, okay, give me period 12 through 12 of my unposted entries, and these should have been in last year. And again, I can use the technique of simply zeroing them out. That does highlight the trick that you should really, when you're doing post to master, you should really always select a single period to post. That's my recommendation. Some places are in the habit of saying 1 through 3 or 1 through 4 or 1 through, but I wouldn't do that. I would always be very clear on which period you're posting. And you can always, if you think there's other entries that got somewhere, then use the journal report to identify them. So you could always say, let's say you're working in period 4, you're closing period 4, and you don't expect there to be any other entries. You could say, I want period 1 through 3, and I just want the unposted entries. And you could quickly see whether or not there are any entries that are unposted. And here I find an entry in period 2 that is unposted. But that way, in other words, just think of how you can ask the computer a question. Show me what's unposted. And that's an easy way to do that. So I like the journal for being able to select those, just the unposted. Now, another report that's very valuable around year end is the trial balance report. Now, after I've done my update to current year, my ending balances from the prior year are transferred into the beginning balance of the new year. And I can proof those beginning balances by using the trial balance report and putting in a period of 0. And when I use 0 as the period, it's going to give me my beginning balances. And I want to start at the beginning of my chart because that's where my assets are. And I'm going to go through my liability and fund balance account. I don't need to look at the beginning balances of my revenues and expenses at this point, because the only accounts that really should have beginning balances are my balance sheet accounts. So I'm going to just pick my balance sheet accounts, and I want to see the actual amounts. And again, I can print this or print preview this. When I look at this report, I will get my beginning balances, and those balances should balance. Now, this particular sample chart of accounts from Open Systems, for whatever reason, it's not balanced. But those should balance. And so obviously that's a year, quite frankly. The sample data is really current through period 11, and so period 12 hasn't been posted or really closed out yet. So in defense of this data, it's really not at a point where I'm trying to really close out a year yet. But in your case, if the context is you want to check the beginning balances of the year, that's the way to do it, using the trial balance period 0, and you get a nice look at your beginning balances, and they should balance. Now, you can also check any year. So if you're in the new year, you can check the beginning balances, but you can also go back into last year and check that the last year started the year in balance. Because as I said earlier, some places don't discover that they forgot to update a prior year, and so that year didn't start in balance. So the trial balance using period 0 is another nice report. And any of those reports can be printed to a file, and again, you can use that technique of doing a find and looking for numbers and things like that. Now, if you discover that there is a problem with a balance of last year did not start in balance and you didn't catch it for a year, you can go to File Maintenance and you can go to the GL accounts. And let's say that you pull up your AR account and you discover that this beginning balance, for whatever reason, didn't get updated correctly. It wasn't updated. You can force a beginning balance change. So you can just type over that number if you want. So I don't have any problem with editing a beginning balance. You never want to edit periods 1 through 13. Those are audited by the activity. But a beginning balance comes over from last year. And if that was not done properly or you have a problem, you can certainly go in there and force that, as I say, hammer that beginning balance. So, and obviously if you do it in one account, you may have to do it in more than one account. Of course, the retained earnings or fund balance account is a common one to have to edit there. In any event, though, you should be able to do that trial balance and come up with a good balance to start a year. And you can run that report obviously any time in the year. So if that's something you haven't checked before, that's something you can do at any time. I often get calls about reconciling the accounts receivable account or the accounts payable account. Now, with the open systems accounting software, as with virtually all of the accounting packages, you can expect that if the entries are made and posted in a subsidiary ledger like the accounts receivable system, then they're going to always be balanced when they come over into the general ledger. So in other words, the activity that's happening in accounts receivable is always balanced, and the activity that's happening in accounts payable is always balanced. Now there are exceptions with hardware problems or corrupted files or server outages, things like that, that sometimes cause an extraordinary situation. But by and large, you can count on the fact that they're going to be balanced. So, uh, but I sometimes get caught in lengthy discussions about balancing accounts only to discover that really the whole issue either was the beginning balance for the start of the year was off, or manual entries have been made throughout the year to that account, and it's the manual entries that have thrown the account balance off. So, uh, one thing to look for, and this often happens. Sometimes there's changes in personnel in mid-year and so forth, and so someone might inherit a situation that they're not quite clear on what's been going on. So what you sometimes want to do is use the journal, for example, to come in and take a look and see what manual entries have been made. And to see what manual entries have been made, I might pick my whole year. And manual entries start with an M, so I'm going to start source code M, and they go through. They can have anything as a second character. Now the squiggly bracket, that's up above the Enter key. It's a squiggly bracket pointing to the right. That's higher than a Z, shall we say. So in other words, that's the highest character, printable character. So it's like saying A through Z. Well, this is better than Z. This is so by saying M space through M squiggly bracket, I'm going to get any entry that started with an M. So now I'm asking for my main account, and I'm looking at the accounts receivable account. So I just pick the accounts receivable account. I pick my whole year. I'm asking for all the manual entries, and I can go ahead and I might want to do both again, make sure I see everything that's happening, and I can print that report, and that's going to show any kind of entries that took place, and you can see what and why. And so sometimes that's definitely worth checking out if you're if you're really having trouble reconciling an account. Look for what manual entries in AR or AP may have affected that. So those are some tips in looking at the reports, some of the reports on how you can audit and how you can go to a file. Also, the post recommendation of always posting one period at a time, and that will give you more flexibility in terms of if you do have problems, how you might solve those problems. So I hope that helps.